Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to my recap of round 8 of Tata Steel. I was pretty busy today helping out my students in my 2000 plus to master in 9 days coaching program, but of course I do want to analyze some games from this tournament, as there were some quite exciting ones. For those who are wondering how the Dubov against Duda game went, well, Dubov's test for COVID fortunately came back negative, and so he was able to play the game, and, well, that game ended a pretty boring draw, so we're not going to waste our time here. Shankland-Carlsen was a game that was not particularly interesting in terms of the later phase of the game, but it was interesting for the fact that Carlsen played a completely new opening, the von Hennig Shira Gambit, that he had never played before this game. And this was against Sam Shankland, a player who also had previously worked for Carlsen in the past for World Championship matches. That of Queen d4 and provoking Bishop d7 is after takes as pawn comes under a little bit of fire. But Carlsen knew that the key here is to go knight f6 and to sacrifice the pawn, because if you take it, black gets a pretty big lead in development as compensation. I'm not going to waste a lot of time on the game, but I will point out that queen d1 is probably the way for white to get a very nice advantage. Just knight f3 and kind of just develop like normally from there is one way to play it. And there's some other subtleties I'm not going to waste time on here, but after queen b3, yeah, black went knight a6 and was sort of able to get some reasonable compensation in the end. After knight f3, queen c5, it ended up being a little bit like a kind of, I guess Rogozin isn't the right word, but kind of like a Marshall type position, where you kind of sack the pawn, but you get some active piece play, and white's not quite able to consolidate fully. And in the end, black sort of got the pawn back where, Shankland sacrificed it, but didn't really get anything special out of the opening, and so it ended a pretty boring draw at the end of the day with the opposite coloured bishops later on. So, that game, yeah, somewhat interesting for the opening, but like I said, even though Elianov recommended this being fine for black in a repertoire database, I would disagree and say that queen d1 is just better for white. I know, because I played these systems myself as black, and this is why I gave it up. But let's move on to some of the more decisive games. And okay, so we know that Carlsen drew, and it going into round Mamedyarov was half a point behind. And so this next game against Praggnanandhaa is quite important for the standings. By the way, if you're enjoying this video, make sure to smash that like button and subscribe to the channel. When you hit the right subscribe button, it's the easiest way to improve your chess. And in fact, someone recently called this the most underrated chess channel, so let's make sure you spread the word around, okay? Alright, let's look at this game. Mamedyarov-Praggnanandhaa from round 8 of Tata Steel Masters, and I guess it's not the world's biggest spoiler to share that Mamedyarov did win this game, and as a result caught Carlsen in the standings going to final rest day. Now maybe I should explain these moves a little bit actually, that this d4 move is kind of like a reversed Alapin with c6, right? So if black goes ed4, well, white is saying, well, bishop g2 is quite useful anyway. I know Gotham Chess did 50 videos on this position already. Okay, maybe with knight on c3 it's a little different, but still, I don't need to educate you on the ways of the Gotham because he did it for you. Let's focus on the move e4 instead. And now Shuck comes up with a slightly unusual move in this position. Now the move d5 is why I've normally played it as white, not letting him go d5 and build their strong center. But it's also very committal to put the pawn on d5, right? And these positions are generally thought to be basically equal if black just plays like in Bogo Indian style, but where the pawn jumped to e4 already, which is kind of a better version. So Shuck plays a move queen a4, realizing that Prague is very well prepared for this tournament. I mentioned the previous recap had a very fast draw with black against Shankland in the Sveshnikov, just completely neutralizing white's preparation. But queen a4 is aimed against d5, so that if d5, which was played in the game, the white can take, and you can't take back with the pawn because of the pin. So it's not like queen a4 is a very critical move, but it does lead to some quite creative play. Computer mentions a very interesting idea of playing queen bishop d7 and kind of sacking the pawn, but getting a nice lead in development, and saying the queen is maybe a little bit misplaced in this kind of structure. If white were to take, for instance, on c6. But anyway, b5 was played in the game, and it was also played with the intention of a pawn sacrifice with knight to f6, which is a very important move, by the way. That if white were to play dc6, for example, well, black can go knight c6, right? Attacking the pawn, and if you keep grabbing pawns, unfortunately, After bishop d7, your queen struggles a bit to find a good square, right? Black is ready to play like knight takes d4, and if you play, let's say, queen a4, they can go bishop to b4, and then play knight takes d4, and you can't take the bishop because of the family fork on c2. So it's kind of just very bad for white. It's like the von Hennig-Shira line before, but with black having a million times more compensation, true or true. So white goes bishop g5, continuing in the creative spirit, and this is the first line of the engine as well. It makes sense that Shak had prepared this, whereas Pragg was figuring out all these good moves like queen a5 over the board. Because you play queen e5, you are accepting the double pawns, and it's not fatal, but it's a little bit annoying somehow. So queen a5 tries to keep more tension, keep a bit more initiative. Knight c3, b4 attacking the knight. Of course, the knight moves out of the way. Knight to d1. And after knight d5, bishop h3. Like, this very creative play by Shak. He realizes that if you go bishop g2, the bishop just looks kind of stupid in the later position. And also maybe a bishop here is undefended in some lines, which could kind of hurt. But bishop h3 is saying, well, let's just trade off the bad bishop before it goes to g2, right? And if black takes, then our knight gets to a more active square of the recapture. And the knight also defends the bishop, guarding against any tactics, yes or yes. And here is where Pragg made his first mistake. What he should have done, and by the way, this is a very common skill that you need to develop if you want to get from 2000 to, let's say, a master level or even a bit below that. You need to know how to assess the piece tension correctly. So instead of taking h3 and helping white develop the knight for free, what you should do is just play knight d7 and leave the knight kind of sitting there. And because the thing is that when you get the knight and the bishop, squabbling with each other like an old married couple, well, that is when your opponent's position loses harmony, and you might even get some of the opponent's pieces to revolt against the white cause. Okay, I'm joking a bit, but the point remains. We want to make the opponent's position as inharmonious as possible, and this would be the way to do it. The fact that computer is saying that you should go bishop g7 and say black got an extra tempo for development, in itself kind of says that white is not really fighting for an advantage, objectively speaking. Probably more in the Shak style is to play f3 and just sack the pawn and open up the center. And maybe this is what Pragg was a bit nervous about. But after knight f6, I mean, you are hitting the bishop and you are hitting the pawn, so I believe that black should just be totally fine here as well. Like, e5, knight e4 is messy, but probably ultimately balanced at the end of the day. So the game saw bishop takes h3, knight h3, knight d7, and yeah, now we see the difference that after rook c1, this pawn is suddenly quite weak. Whereas if you played it with the bishop still here, you kind of, just say, well, go fart somewhere else to white. If you have like bishop b7 or whatever. But yeah, this is kind of the difference. h6, bishop d2, rook c8. And now white plays with a lot of nice energy at this point. And after giving stockfish to cattle prod, it also realizes that f3 is very strong. Simply to try to get an e4 and destroy in the center. Well, I guess you go queen f3 first after ef3. Saying that this pawn is small fry compared to the monster attack against the black king stuck in the center. Well, black goes knight 7 f6 instead, trying to keep the hold over the light squares. The problem is that he's behind in development, and after knight f2, black is essentially losing the battle for the light squares. After ef3, apparently best move is just to play takes, but white goes e4, which, to be fair, is also giving a pretty big advantage. It does give black moves like queen b5 trying to hit here, but after queen f3, black will still be clearly worse. But yeah, after knight b6, black just gets kind of murdered pretty badly. So let's see how the butchering went. Bishop b7 was played. Knight e3 is a nice move, eyeing up a knight f5 to attack the weaknesses. This is also why black doesn't really have time to get his king castled, as it were, because then his king comes under a massive attack. Queen a4 is trying to trade the queens, and actually, it turns out the ending after take e5 is actually just dead one, according to the machine. That somehow black has way too many weaknesses and no real development and so on. But queen d3 is also winning. Black doesn't have the time to take a2 because, well, we go boom, boom, and thanks for the game. So queen b5 is played. And yeah, ultimately white decides just to cash into a winning ending. Computer thinks knight d5, 5 is a little more to the point. But instead of this incisive approach, we had take. And okay, to be fair, this is also a more or less winning position, and I don't want to spend like loads and loads of time going through like how white converted a +3 or more advantage. But still, we can admire the energy of Shark's play with knight f5, attacking the pawn. If black goes castles, I mean, you even have moves like rook c1, for example, to threaten rook c8 and, some tactics of removing the defender, as it were. Also, just knight e4 directly and just taking the pawn and, in a certain sense, just being a pawn up with a dominant position is also utterly winning for white. So black goes g6, but yeah, we have rook c1, little intermezzo, knight b, db6. You could take the h6 pawn, but white decides to go knight e7 and grab the pawn back this way, which maybe does give black a little bit more of a glimmer of hope if he plays knight d5. Like, it should still be losing, but at least an iron d5 kind of holds the position, at least for the moment. But probably not for very long after bishop c5 or something. Well, the game saw knight b d5, and Shark was just able to transition with bishop e7. Actually, I would have probably gone bishop d6, because at the moment, black has a kind of superfluous knight problem, where both the knights would like to go to d5, true or true. And so, rather than bishop e7, like, this might give black some glimmer of hope. Like, if black goes f6 and tries to trade pawns, maybe this gives better chances to save the game, for example. But the game saw g5, and yeah, after h3, again, black should still try to push the f-pawn, and, like, your best chance as black is to try to trade pawns when you're losing, like this, and so he plays f6, when f5 again probably forces that trade of ef6 to give better chances to hold. But instead, yeah, the difference now is that white just goes rook c5, and everything just collapses. So the game ended f5, knight d2. As you can see, I'm going through this pretty fast, because I do have a lot of games to get through. So rook d8, knight f3, b4, and it's just a mopping up procedure. Like, any GM worth their salt would win probably even against stockfish as white. So rook c3, hitting the weakness. Rook c8, a little bit tricky, but still we know that if the pawn ending is winning, then almost certainly the knight endgame is winning as well, true or true. And with the move h4, we are forcing an additional weakness in the black structure with either gh4 or g4, and also in this case f5 is a backward pawn. So knight b6, knight g2, knight a4, knight e3, ignoring the attack because we've got better. And if they go king e6, we got knight c4 to defend the pawn. Important point is that after king d5, you can actually just let them take the knight, because if they take e6, they can't catch your pawn with the knight in time. So white black goes knight b2, white just collects the harvest, yum 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 yum, and another yum yum, knight takes g4. I mean, who cares what Stockfish says? I mean, it's plus 12 or whatever. h5, knight c3, king d2, stopping the counterplay. And after knight e4, king c2, Prague got the hint and resigned at this point. So a pretty crushing win, honestly. Prague didn't really manage to get out of the opening. And it really came down to playing bishop h3. You got to keep the tension with knight d7, and then you're probably okay. Like, at least you can get your pieces developed with h6, knight f6, bishop out, castle, right? But here, it just doesn't work like with bishop h3. You give white too big a lead in development. So let's move on to the next decisive game. This one was between Andrei Esipenko playing as Anish-Giri. And this was one I remember actually that it was kind of funny. I was watching a little bit the commentary on Chess24 of Peter Svidler and Jan Gustafsson, but they seemed to be very sort of dejected about the position, like very kind of bored and not really feeling it. And it was kind of surprising because actually if you play out these opening moves, which, okay, I'm pretty sure I've been explained in a billion other YouTube videos, but in general, the short Cliff Notes version is white is trying to pressure e5, and black is trying to claim that this pawn is a strength, not a weakness, due to the space advantage. And the real answer, of course, is somewhere in between, with the engine giving some 0-0-0 if you go to depth 80. So knight to b6, attacking the bishop so that if it retreats, you can maybe take this pawn. White goes h3, kicking, or rather putting the question to the bishop, and then plays bishop b3. And yeah, there's a position like, obviously, any professional player worth their salt has stayed this position pretty much to death. And yet still somehow black managed to win it. So let's see how it happened. Knight takes e5. So this is the idea that white is getting the pawn back. Queen f5 defends the bishop. And, g4, queen f2 would be a little bit embarrassing, to say the least. So instead, after queen f5, white just goes back with knight e to f3, keeping this symmetrical structure and, well, trying to make the argument that, g4 maybe threatens to win a piece. But Giri says, I don't care, rook f8, and, disagrees with the engine's ideas of developing other ways because Giri studied the position a lot more deeply and knows that live book is dumb. So take. I mean, it's sort of a position where, like, if you are a commentator, like, you're doing this on Twitch, like, you're pumped, you've got the hype train, you're saying, get in now, and where you're going to get extra benefits with your $5 sub. But no, they said, oh, just a boring position, knight against 3 pawns, like, what are we doing? Let's watch some chess.com. Okay, I'm joking a bit, of course, but yeah, knight e5 is the important move to play here. The point being that if white does take the knight, with the knight or with the rook, you're going to have queen h3 and just auto-draw, because avoiding the draw will mean you get mated instead with queen f2. So white goes knight h2, of course, this is still players preparing, but general point that black doesn't want to trade the queens because, well, then white just consolidate his king completely. We want to extract the maximum out of the attack, so queen g6 going for knight d3, and that is pretty dangerous, so bishop c2 at least ensures that we can lob off the knight d3, captures, and not captures and get their rook in the game for free, but the move knight df3. Computer gives knight b3 at first, but it also comes to 0-0-0 if you press spacebar enough times. So after this, we ultimately get this position where we have the 3 pawns against the knight. And which piece is better? Well, this is where you got to show the energy, where you got to get hyped up and say, all right, folks, let's get these pawns running. You know, we've got to sprint. Let's see which one can get to the end of the board fastest. Whereas white is saying, who cares about promoting past pawns if I'm going to mate your king with some boom, boom, and, you know, all this kind of good stuff. Maybe bishop in as well, because you're meant to bring all the pieces in the attack, or they take away your GM title, I've heard. Okay, jokes aside, game went bishop f4, c6, rook d2, kicking out the prelate. If you go knight g4, probably it's bishop c5, and the pieces are treading a little bit on each other's toes. Like, you want to go rook g1, but obviously the bishop is covering it. And if you go b4, there are some weird tactics like rook e4, where black says, hey, I can play the counter-attacking game too. So white goes rook d2, bishop e3. Like, not a whole lot is kind of happening. Just a position where white's got the knights, black's got the pawns, and we're going to see who's going to win. Well, we know that Giri wins the battle, but Giri wins the war, but did Esipenko have a way to win the battle? Let's find out. Knight d4, knight c4, getting the knight b6 that is always bad according to the dead Tarash. Get that piece into the game. Rook f2, rook a8, all the pieces are in the game now. We have rook a to f1, knight to d6. Actually, rook a f1 maybe is a little bit careless. You should probably go knight f5 first and try to attack the king like this. Because let's say you provoke g6, like, suddenly that king becomes quite weak if you force a pawn move in front of the king and you get, you know, some checks and some forks in the process. The white sets go for a very sort of lax rook af1. The knight goes back to d6, defend the pawn, get out of the way of any b3 business. And funnily enough, black might already be a little bit better at this point, but white's moves next moves definitely don't help. Like knight f5, I mean, why not just bring the king up and sort of sit on the position? But maybe Esipenko was still playing for an advantage and he thought he could keep up some momentum when actually after take and f6, you know, it kind of puts a bit of a dead end to the f5 play. Computer thinks that rook e7 is even better. Probably go g6 f5 and try to kill the knight or something. But anyway, f6 is played. White goes king g2. We have king f7. So far, while computer is going to say, oh, this move is 0.01% better. And you're going to have, you know, the keyboard warrior shouting, oh, blunder. He didn't play the move that gives plus 0.15 instead of plus 0.13. Well, of course, you know, we're professionals. Like, we don't waste our time, you know, with such memes. We focus on the chess itself. So rook d1. We have a little tricky move here of h5, saying that if white takes the pawn, then rook e2 and you take here. But actually, rook h5 is probably the best move, because it turns out that in the process, a lot of these pawns get hoovered off, and that helps decide who is worse. So rook d7 captures, and I don't know, rook a5, I assume, is the idea. Nice to know I'm able to find a move without the stockfish turned on first. And yeah, black is probably a little bit better because the pawns are a bit weak and the knight is a bit silly. But you're going to get that knight into the game, you're going to get the king in the game, and it should be pretty close to equal at the end. Like, you're holding the passed pawns off for the moment, right? But instead, white goes rook f2, trying to keep it solid, but the faster these pawns run, the closer they get to queening. You know, with passed pawns, the further they get down the board, the more valuable they get. We have rook d7, the rook goes free to e7. We have rook d6, rook e6, Russian style. Just move back and forth. Rook d7, rook 87. Do that Melbourne shuffle. Bring the Aussie culture to the Tata Steel. Okay, this is sort of, yeah, obviously, Giri is, represents the Netherlands. He's like the local hero. Previously was in Russia and previously in Japan before that. So he's a guy of culture, let's say. And because he's a guy of culture, he knows how to convert these advantages into wins. Though he didn't play king g6, which would be kind of a nice move to get out of the pin. But, okay, g4. Computer doesn't like it, but I get the idea. You want to stop their knight moving forward and make the knight move backward. The problem is moving knight backward is actually kind of what white should do here. And yeah, if you go h4 and you try to, continue dominating the knight and show that you're a good student of the Botvinnik school of chess, well, they're going to go rook h8 and kind of trail you, like h3, king g3, leaves your pawn kind of weak. And if you go g3, which was probably the whole point of this, then rook f4, rook e2, and yeah, you take b2, but you're losing a bit of these pawns in the process, say if g2. Knight h3 just ends up just coming to some kind of equality, like rook b2, and even though black has 4 pawns for the piece, you go rook h7, you trade off the rooks, and yeah, you probably go what? I'm guessing, yeah, rook h4, and okay, the nice point, which, okay, I did not see when I suggested knight h1, but it's kind of cool that you have rook to h7. You pick off the pawn on b7, because otherwise 4 pawns is a bit too much for one noble steed to deal with. And at the end of the day, you collect here, you put the rook behind the passed pawn, because that's what every Russian schoolboy knows. And the game ends in a draw, apparently. Unless, white falls asleep at the wheel, or black hangs a rook to a knight fork, or other crazy things that you'd normally see in Guess the Elo, not in Tata Steel. Well, instead, I guess the players are in time trouble. I mean, it's not easy dealing with these free connected passed pawns. It's like, say if you're playing football and you have this trauma of being tackled and having some, injuries or something. Well, instead, I played the move rook h8, remembering the old Soviet chess principle, or actually it's more Nimzovich principle of rook behind the passed pawn, but, Soviets claim whenever it's a good principle, yeah, we came up with it. But jokes aside, yeah, after king g6 now, the rook kind of looks a little bit silly. The knight looks a little bit silly as well, because after knight f1, the difference is that you haven't weakened your structure of h4, so black can just go rook e8 and say, well, I'm going to trade off your rook behind a pawn and just go boom, 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 thanks for the game. And there's not a lot that white can really do to stop it, to be quite frank. So white goes rook g8, we build a bridge with rook to g7. Yeah, I would have gone king h7, but probably the guy was just trying not to get flagged. So rook g7, rook f8, king g5, and you can kind of see here how, well, maybe it's not winning immediately for black, but still it's quite difficult for white to find a good way to deal with the pawns. Though he is at least stopping black playing f5, so that's the reason this isn't like plus 10 already and is only like plus 1 or so. So a4, black goes a5, saying, well, if white runs out of pawn moves, then he's going to blunder something. They'll probably b6 first, a little more flexible, but okay, Indran is saying 0, 0, 0, but what do the computers know? Turns out not much about practical chess, because instead of playing rook b8 and, going tax collector style and going after the pawns, instead we saw ba5, ba5, rook a8, oh, I'm grabbing a pawn. No, you're not, rook to e5, and still even here, actually, it's still 0, 0, 0 at a high depth. But practically speaking, it's very difficult. I mean, one has to sort of play moves like knight g3 and hope he can hold an ending a pawn down later, which is not a whole lot of fun. And that's sort of the reason why knight d2 is a mistake. You kind of need the knight to be able to sack for the 2 pawns. Because now you can actually play g3 anyway. Maybe you're thinking knight f3 and this looks scary, but actually just king f4. We go into the discovered check bravely, like King Alexander leading the charge, because after knight e5 we just take and boom, it's a check. And we're just up 2 pawns for nothing. Okay, 1 pawn, but our pawns are a million miles faster than white's, and this is why we just win. So instead the game went rook f1. Black goes h3, nice little tactic to finish the game. After king h3, g2, white has to choose, which child he has to give up. And after rook f2, nice move, king to e3. And white resigned because if you don't play rook g2, then yeah, you resign. But if you play rook takes g2, king f3, and white can't take the rook because rook h5 checkmate. So that was easy enough. Pretty nice game by Giri, and it goes to show that just because you play 1 e4, e5 does not mean that you are begging for a draw. It can be used as a winning weapon as well, as this game shows. Game between Kayak against Report was some weird French where both players were trying to pretend to be Alpha Zero, and when both players are pretending to play at 3,500 level, normally the game ends in a draw. So that game ended in a draw. And we had this game between Gujarati, or rather Vidit, against Vidit-Grandelius. And yeah, this was kind of a weird game. I mean, the opening was kind of funny, so I guess I'll show you that at least. That game went d4, knight f6, knight f3, and yeah, this knight beat e2. It's a line that I was playing a bit about, I don't know, 10 to 12, or let's say 10 to 13 years ago. It's kind of like an Annie Grunfeld sort of idea, where if they go d5, you say, okay, I'm going to play like b4 or e3 and b4, and you don't get your usual Grunfeld c5 break. Now, computers don't really care too much if they think like a5, c5 is a 0, 0, 0. But if black hasn't come with a clear plan, I mean, you can easily play, let's say, bishop e2, c4, castle. Like, it's very systematic the way in which white plays like bishop b2 or a4 and bishop to a3. So it's a sort of line that's very strategic. If your opponent's not well prepared for it, you could potentially get a very nice advantage out of the opening with a clear sort of plan. In fact, it's very similar actually to a system like going b5 and d5, kind of like a similar idea, but with colors reversed as such. Though it is true here, the extra tempo does probably give white a small edge, but I digress. Well, in the game, Grandelius plays bishop g7, but he doesn't play it with the intent of transposing a normal Gallopierts with d6 and castles. Instead, Grandelius says, well, I've got to get the creative juices flowing, which means, in other words, playing the first line of the engine. So castles, not fearing the move e5. By the way, if white does decide to chicken out and play a move such as bishop d3, for example, then maybe black's idea was to do some creative thing like c5 and, say, well, it's a pawn sack, except it's not a pawn sack, because I go queen a5 and I get the pawn back and, steer towards some kind of Sicilian structure like this, for instance. It's kind of like a dragon, where your white knights are a little bit weirdly placed. The queen is also weirdly placed, but it can go back to c7, so it's not that big of a deal. And should probably be about equal in this case. But Vidit says, alright, you want to, come on, bring it on? Okay, I'll come. I'll be the bull raging forward, e5. Now black goes knight h5, doing a little dance with the knights, and this is where we had a fun, who needs dancing with wolves when you have dancing with knights? g4, knight f4. Knight to e4. I mean, I was looking at this and I was like, what is this? Like, the player's just trolling, but no, engine says it's a first line every line. This is what you guys have to look forward to when you start doing deep engine analysis as a professional player. So black goes d5, ignoring the attack on the knight and going for the counter attack. If you're wondering, well, isn't white just winning a pawn with ed6? It's not a blunder, it's a sacrifice. We go knight to d5. We go captures, captures. I mean, look at this. This is just this glaring weakness. f4 is weak. If you go h3, f5, boom, we're opening up those lines, making that white position look like Swiss cheese, and black is apparently just better. So that's the real reason why you don't grab the pawn. But instead, knight g3, we keep the attack on the knight. The knight goes back to e6, only safe square. White now plays an incredible idea. Absolutely beautiful. Chef's kiss mwah level of beauty. It's knight to f5, or as Ben Feingold likes to say, knife f5. And well, the knife really comes in here, because if you take, white takes and the knight has nowhere to go. And after takes, you can even play knight takes d4 if you're a genius, where they take the pawn, but you go bishop h6, you go rook g1, you throw all the pieces of the king and you say you have checkmate. I don't know if you do or not, but, it looks pretty scary. And computer says you have to sack the exchange with king h8, which is pretty depressing. So instead of this, black goes c5. He says, well, let's light that board on fire. Let's throw some kerosene on that chessboard. I don't know if the kerosene kills the COVID virus, but, I guess they were wearing masks and didn't have to worry about this. So knight takes g7, winning the bishop pair, leaving those dark squares a little bit tender. And now, if you're a computer, you play the move king takes g7 and say again, come at me. I'm ready. And after the move h4, you hit back f6 and open up that f file for the attack. And Yeah, I don't know what's happening in this position. It's totally crazy, but apparently it's 0-0-0 at a high depth. Though maybe you go h5, you can try to put a pawn in their face. There are definitely fun ideas here. g5, I mean, yeah, you could take c5 maybe. I mean, it's a crazy position. Like, White's got a bishop pair, but he has virtually no development. So White's going to try and catch up in development and consolidate, but, it's not so easy when the center is kind of being lit on fire like this. So yeah, I don't know what's happening. Crazy, unclear position. Indran says slightly better for White. I have no idea. Well, the game saw knight takes g7 instead, and yeah, now White plays a little deadly quiet move. Well, I know how deadly it is, but at least, distance 4. We protect the pawn that is killing the knight. And this ends up being a bit of a sort of problem for Black for the next moves, in fact. So after cd4, White brings the bishop out, bishop h6, because White played a simpler recapture when you can do it later. Queen a5, Black is saying this is too scary, I need to trade the queens. We have queen to d2, queen takes d2, and not king takes d2, but the move knight takes d2. So that when Black goes knight c6 and hangs on and attacks, we can now play the move f4, having cleared the way with the knight, so the pieces all work together like a good tag team. We don't have people complaining about, oh, I'm getting paid a lot less than you, this is not fair. In any case, the move f6 was played, trying to open things up, but unfortunately, White is kind of just much better here. Well, much better maybe is a bit strong, but I definitely much prefer White's position in practice. Because after long castles, I mean, how are you going to defend these pawns, This bishop is constantly in your face, like a bone in your throat that you just can't get rid of. After rook to e8, probably rook d8 is better, but it's kind of a bit depressing to have to play such a passive move and, babysit a mere pawn. This is not what rooks dream of. They dream of the open files, so rook e8. And here, yeah, bishop g2 would actually be kind of annoying, because to defend that pawn would mean playing a move like bishop e6, but then you're blocking in the rook, which is not great either. Well, White plays move knight b3 in the game, just going after the pawn in the most simple fashion. However, there was an amazing Indian move that would actually maintain the balance. And this is, by the way, why it was good to play bishop g2 first, to avoid this possibility. If you want, you can write in the comments below. This is move 18 of Vidit against Grandelius for Black, so that we all know what you're talking about. What's the move to play as Black here in order to be able to save himself? And if you don't see it, you kind of get murdered the way Grandelius did in the game. So the move here is not knight e6, which kind of just is very, very bad at the end of the day. But rather the move bishop to f5. You put the bishop on pre, not just because the computer says so, but because if takes and your bishop is the one that gets trapped and you defend the pawn, it's like black magic at this point with such moves. And I mean, if someone finds this move as Black, you all don't give them the COVID test. You give them the, oh, are you using an engine test, as it were. So anyway, if White goes bishop g7 first, trying to win the piece, intermezzo, bishop e4, hitting the rook. And yeah, you don't really get compensation if you sack the exchange, so rook g1 take, and position ends up being some kind of boring draw. Okay, I guess White can try some weird moves, but general principle is this pawn will get taken, but d5 is well defended by the anchored bishop, and Black should hold, right? Instead of this, Black goes knight e6 and dies a very painful, but not that slow death. Bishop to g2, attacking this pawn. Computer likes f5 as well, but I like bishop g2, develop with tempo. Knight decides to continue its very depressing journey with knight c7. I mean, what's this maneuver being like? I mean, here, 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 here. I mean, yeah, I'm already getting dizzy just looking at this knight. So I could just play the simple move knight d4, and, sometimes the simple move is the best move. Turns out to be the case here. If you're worried about, I don't know, some monkey business with rook e2 or some other dumb idea like this, yeah, you just play bishop f3, and, well, if you want to really show off here, not that it's really needed, but you could even play a move like bishop d1 and just ask this rook, where are you going? And try to trap him in some kind of way like this. It looks pretty good at the very least, according to computer, and, well, computer usually is right about these things. But okay, you don't even need to see bishop d1, like rook d3 is also just way, way better for White, so slightly curious that White didn't just go for the simple take a pawn, but decided to light the board on fire to Vidit, trying to bring out his inner Tal with the move f5. I guess, when you've given up already traded queens, you can't, play queen sacrifice and Tal spirit. So you gotta, make do with what you got. G takes f5. Now actually g5 would be an interesting idea, just trying to open black up on the light dark squares. Given that white has an unopposed dark square bishop, it kind of makes sense, right? Well, rook hf1 was played in the game. Which actually, if black just takes everything and says, you know what, I'm not afraid of your attack, I'm just going to take everything and say you can't mate me. I mean, it's not that easy for white to actually mate the black king. Like, the king's just going to sit here and say, you can't catch me, na. But yeah, to do this in a game that requires real nerves of steel and kind of, I guess, requires you to realize that the alternatives are just really, really bad. So after king f7, trying to, bail out. It's not a very good bailout because, well, black is still up a pawn for now, but white's about to get it back. The knight can even get attacked like this as well, and yeah, it's just very, very sad. Rook g8 was played. White went rook to d2, and yeah. Computer was already saying you have to play, like, take, and again, sort of get rid of this pawn. It's just suffocating all the minor pieces. So just so you're wondering that this is not a pawn blunder, a piece blunder. The point is king g6, and you do have a counter-attack. Okay, white is still better, but it's not like you're winning or anything. Like, black can probably hold this to a draw with rook g6 if he plays correctly. Like, worst case, can go d3 and give back the pawn so at least don't have an isolated pawn, or more precisely, give white an isolated pawn as well in the process. But yeah, we have knight e5, and knight e5 just doesn't work. Knight d4, and black is just strategically busted. As after b3, we are just taking all the good squares from this knight. We're taking good squares from the knight and the bishop, and with white having the bishop pair and the space and the weaknesses to attack, black is completely dominated. And the game ended pretty brutally. Rook a8, a4, just killing the knight once again, and also killing the bishop by making sure all our pawns are on the same color complex as the opponent's remaining bishop, following Capablanca's rule very nicely. a6 is played. Bishop f4 brings the bishop back to the action. Rook e7 and rook ff2, slow improvement. Bishop to c6. I mean, whatever black does, he's kind of screwed, so let's just play the moves. Rook d7. King a3, just going for a little sojourn. Apparently bishop f3, and this is even better, just trying to go for some sort of mating net. Or if they do take, you kind of, just say that, well, black's position just kind of looks stupid with the horrible minor pieces. Even just rook c3, and yeah, black is completely tied up, right? White goes king a3, saying let's give black a little rope to hang himself. After knight e8, white then plays the move c4, and yeah, the point of c4 is that if you take on c4, try and say you win a pawn, white just goes knight takes c6 here, and well, if you play b takes c6, for instance, trying to keep some parity, you just go captures. You're threatening the knight. You're threatening bishop d5 skewers. They can't really go knight b6 because a5 and your bishop gets to d5 anyway, so black is just completely busted here. After knight g7 in the game, white just takes and just liquidates to win the house. So rook d g8, dc6, white is up 2 pawns, has the bishop pair, and black's position is just very, very bad, so he just resigned here. Yeah, pretty crushing game. Granted, Vidit did give Grandelius a move or two where he could have got back into the fight. Like bishop f5 was a particularly beautiful example, and as such here, which is why bishop g2 first was better. But still a nice game where Vidit showed some good preparation, got a nice initiative with the nice unopposed dark squared bishop, and yeah, somehow black never really managed to solve this problem. And with that, we've actually pretty much completed our coverage of the Masters section before the rest day. Caruana Van Voorhis was just a very theoretical draw where black played the Dilworth variation, which the line just has a very good reputation for black. Like, white never really had any chances to be better, just, very balanced position. Black has the 2 pawns and a rook. White has the 2 minor pieces, but only give enough for equality objectively. Now, it is funny that computer often misevaluates these positions and thinks that white is better at first, but if you go deeper, it's just 0-0-0 territory, or pretty close to it. So the final game, was that Dubov-Duda game that I mentioned. Not a great deal happened, which is pretty equal the whole way through. They got to some kind of boring position like this where, not a heck of a lot is happening, and draw was agreed many moves later. So a bit of a non-game, really. And that means we can now move to a bit more action. I don't want to waste your time with boring draws. Let's see the blood spilled on the board. And now we can get into the Challengers tournament. So what's happening in the Challengers? Well, what's happening is that Arjun Erigaisi is back on fire. He had a draw against Jumabayev the previous round where he was in a much worse position, but he defended like a lion and saved the game. But in this game against Jonas Bull-Bjerre, he brings out the beast mode. No boring London systems or d4s. He goes e4, c5, knight f3, and Bjerre does not know that knight c6 and d6 are the best moves for black. Either that or he knows and he just doesn't care because he played the move e6 here. And so, yeah, open ceiling is, of course, the main line, and we could do a million videos on this, but Erigaisi says, you know what, let's just play a shortcut, g3, get you out of book and outplay you on technique, and, you know, it works pretty well in the game. After knight c6, bishop g2. The approach that's normally meant to equalize for black here is just to go knight f6, and, you know, if d3 just headed back towards, say, towards a normal king's Indian attack, right? I mean, I can go queen e2, they can go knight bd2. Apparently they can even go castles and postpone the decision for the move, because you get good comp if they, you know, if they grab the pawn. That's a more deep point, but okay, the general idea is that this is probably the way for black to equalize. There are some creative souls like myself who like to play queen e2 and try to maybe keep the option of playing d4 in some positions. Because now with d5 you can even play like ed5 and try to get a more open position for an initiative. But if black knows it's a little salty of playing e5 and bishop e7, you kind of end up in a poor man's sort of Roy Lopez's white, where your bishop is just nowhere near as good on g2 as it would be, let's say, on b3 or b5 by comparison. And so black just kind of plays, you know, normal Chigarin Spanish-style moves and just equalizes, essentially. But if black didn't do this, he played the move d5 instead, which leads to potentially IQP-type positions. And, well, actually, white got some value out of the move order because, well, he was able to castle, you know, get out of any annoying queen e7 checks or something after knight f6, d4. So it's kind of like a, what's the way to compare it? It's kind of like a Tarrasch defense where your pawn is on c2 instead of on e2. So a little bit different. And in the game after this, black plays cd4. I'm guessing that Bjerre may have been a little bit caught off by this move order. Because I think bishop e7 is meant to be the main line. You know, just let them take and you take back on c5. But still after knight c3, I mean, this pawn does come under some pressure. And, you know, to be fair, white is kind of better in these positions as well. Like dc5, bishop takes c5, for example. d4 is a move, but it's not that great. I mean, you can even play something like a3, for instance, just maybe to kick the bishop out. Or, you know, if they try to stop it, you go bishop g5. And, well, there is little salties like d4. You can go like knight e4 ideas or knight b5. I mean, white is slightly better because of the weakness of the pawn, right? Because normally, yeah, you don't get knight c3 so quickly, but somehow you got it in this version. So black goes cd4 and goes for the move bishop e7. I guess his idea is he wants to keep that bishop here, so that, for example, if knight c3 castles, like bishop g5 is a bit less effective when the bishop is already covering the pin, right? You know, bishop g5 would just be met with h6, and the fact that the knight would come under fire means that white's not in time to take the pawn, and therefore black is just fine with the bishops. So white played a bit better in the game. He played the move of h3 in this position just here, which is just a little prophylaxis to prepare the move bishop to e3, without, on the other hand, running into moves like knight g4 or bishop g4. I mean, to be fair, you could have played knight c3 first. It would likely transpose. And yeah, maybe the best move for black is to play something like rook e8 and, you know, knight c3, bishop b4, just try to, you know, get rid of the pressure on this pawn and maybe create some imbalance to give some chances as black. Though I guess if white goes knight c2, yeah, if your bishop has to go back, it's not the world's greatest IQP position, but you're not losing either, I guess. After knight d4, though, you're kind of just helping white to develop with the recapture. The bishop gets to a more active square, so it's a little bit of a concession. You know, bishop e6 defends the pawn, but it's a little passive at the same time. So black goes bishop f5 and tries to create counterplay, meeting the move knight to c3 with the move knight to e4. Again, you probably just have to go rook c8 and kind of just accept that you're worse and go for a more solid defense. The attempt to be aggressive with knight e4 and try to create some tension in the position just doesn't really have the desired effect. And the reason is because white's not forced to take and help black improve his structure, but as is well known, we can let them take us instead. Because after rook e1, if they play to move knight takes c3, well, while they were trading off our knights, we just got our rook to the open file for free, but also we got this pressure on the d5 pawn because the bishop moved out of the way, right? And at bishop e6, you can even just play a move like bishop d4 back again if you want to. I mean, there are a lot of good moves, but certainly anchoring this pawn in place to target and just, piling up, maybe creating some new weaknesses on the queen side. It's clear that black is clearly worse, and it's not a very fun defensive task, to say the very least. Unfortunately, the attempt to create some complexity with bishop f6 just completely backfires. And the reason is that after bishop takes f6, well, queen f6, knight d5 is just GG, basically, but after knight f6 admitting the mistake, white just grabs a free pawn, and I'm not quite sure what Bjerre missed in the game. Like, I guess he probably just had an off day, because maybe he thought that he could play after trade of queen's bishop c2, because this is, after all, what happened in the game. Like, maybe he was carrying on bishop e7, rook at b8, and having some counterplay. Although, even then, you can still play rook e7, who's still up a pawn, but Erigaisi's move rook e7 shows why this guy is already 2700 plus strength, despite having a range as 2632. So rook a8 was played. White just grabs the free pawn, because why not? a5, I mean, white's technique was just very, very precise. I mean, honestly, like, the way I play this game was, I think, at least as good as, like, an average Carlsen game in terms of his technique. I mean, you could go b3 if you want to try and fix the pawn as a weakness. If they go a4, you go b4, and still your pawn moves forward, and still this guy is a bit weak. But the move rook a1, well, you get all the pieces in the game. It's also a winning move, objectively. Black goes a4 here, trying to, fix this pawn as a weakness. White plays bishop c6, showing that, well, I'll show you a weakness. Black goes rook to d4. If black does play rook b8, by the way, trying to go after this pawn, even a move like rook e8 is just very strong, where if you're able to trade off all the rooks, the bishop winning is just a very easy win, because your king will just come over here and just gobble on a4. But anyway, the game went rook d4 instead. A more tenacious defense, but not by a lot. Rook d7's a nice move. I have a little geometry here with rook b4 and rook to d2. Who said that maps wouldn't make you a better chess player? Because if rook b2, you pin and you win. Rook to c1. So black goes bishop f5, and the game ended a3. And, the rook is running out of squares on the a file, so white is up a pawn for nothing. And actually, it's even better than, like, just being up a pawn for nothing, because you've got the connected passed pawns. Whereas black's majority is a very long way from creating any kind of meaningful passed pawn, true or true. So rook e5, centralize the rooks, rook fb8, rook b5, showing your trickiness that they can't take twice, because you have rook b8 checkmate, evidently. But also, training rooks just makes it easier for you to win, right? So king f8, rook d8 again, showing his tactical flair, take. And after bishop e6 and bishop b3, black just resigned here. Because my white is up a pawn, but these pawns are also now ready to run down the board, supported by the rook. If black brings a king to defend it, then these pawns become weak. So it's a very, very easy win. Once you bring the count, that we'll make sure of it. So a very convincing win by Erigaisi. I think a very good argument for this g3 move order, which, if I'm not mistaken, I think was also recommended by Wesley So in one of his chessball courses. So maybe that's where Erigaisi got this idea. In any event, it led him to 7 out of 8 in a performance rating of, I don't know, way over 2800. It's probably 2900 plus, but I haven't checked it. There are also some other games that were played in the challenges, and, well, we have a little bit of time to go a little deeper, because I was relatively efficient, let's say, in getting through the other games. The Lucas Fan for East Nguyen game ended in a draw, so Nguyen kept the equal second place at, well, he was in outright second place before, but he was in equal second place after this round. 1.5 points behind Erigaisi, and that is because Vidit-Grandelius, the Kazakh player, got a very nice win with a black piece against Ganguly, and, well, let's have a quick look, because I'm kind of curious to see how this game went, and, after a very strong start to the tournament, I mean, Ganguly, fell a little bit by the wayside in the last couple of rounds, as it were. In any case, the game continued with c3, knight f6, and you may recall that Erigaisi played the move d4 against Ganguly in the round 6 recap to, take a big lead in the tournament. But Ganguly plays d3, and he plays this a4 move that he had prepared for this event. And at first glance, a4 looks like a bit of a concession, because you allow black to play a5 in one go. Whereas, by contrast, let's say a line like a castle's a6 and a4. In some of these lines, you actually end up seeing black playing a5 a move later voluntarily. For example, something like, let's say, h3, h6, For example, rook e1 castles a3, like a5 is actually one of the main lines for black in this position to not allow b4 and the queenside expansion, as it were. So I guess that Ganguly's argument is that after a5 that, in this position, maybe white can try to benefit from the fact that the structure is very committed to try to play some more useful moves in h3 and rook to e1. Though that being said, Ganguly just played h3 anyway, kind of saying, well, I'm happy to play a normal type of position, a tempo down. And Jumabayev will decide not just to play like the normal h6 and like knight e7, g6, like this is a plan that you sometimes see in these positions, at least with a pawn on a6, to try and reroute the knight and prepare a d5 push, at least to make the pawn structure more flexible. But I like the move bishop e6 by Jumabayev. It's a little bit more direct. If white plays bishop takes and he's kind of, weakened his f4 square a little bit because of h3. And normally to make this work as white, you need to go like b4 and sort of have some queenside play, but a5 clearly stops that, true or true. So white goes bishop b5, and black plays this move knight a7, and actually, Jumabayev was going in a fort quite a lot around this point. But it turned out to be quite justified, in fact. You see, the point of knight a7 is that white doesn't really have a good square for the bishop. And if black just gets the bishop there for free, then if anything, black is better. So white goes d4, he pushes through. We have knight takes b5, d takes c5, knight to a7, and yeah, the knight's doing some weird maneuvers, but at the end of the day, if white were to trade and just trade everything, the arising position is just very nice for black. Because the e4 pawn would be a little bit weak, even this pawn is a little bit tender, and black would have a very nice game. So instead, Ganguly goes queen e2, keeping a bit more tension in the position. This game was only 36 moves, so I believe we can get through it in full. We had knight c6, and yeah, now maybe this is the right time to think about going cd for e6 and start playing more for equality. But it's a very hard mental shift to make when you've got the white pieces, right? Rook d1 is maybe not a big mistake per se, but I consider it a little bit imprecise, because you give black bishop b3 with tempo, which is kind of annoying. And maybe the best bet is just to admit the mistake with rook e1 and say, well, at least I'll get the tempo back with knight d2 later, right? But after rook d2, then the rook kind of gets in the way of the other pieces. And after d5, black was just much better. A key point being that white is not winning a piece with the move c4, because we have the move bishop takes f3, which is quite important. We can even play knight d4, actually, if you want, because, for queen b7, the queen kind of ends up in jail with no real key to escape. But of course, even a move like queen e7 is probably also just very good for black. Yeah, apparently Ering is just winning here. So white goes queen d1, trying to do something with the pin, but after this, just queen d7 is another very good move by Jumabayev. Realizing against c4, bishop f3, that ending is just horrible for white. And after knight g5, h6, white is kind of just clutching at straws at this stage. So c4 was played. H takes g5, cd5, knight d4, and I mean, look at white's pieces. All of the queenside pieces still on their starting squares, and also this pawn is being lost, so we can see that white has been completely and utterly outplayed at this point. The game ended rook d3, knight d5, bishop g5. So at least white is getting the pawn back, but it's still really bad. Apparently knight b4, just taking the outpost and going like f6 and just kicking the bishop, just leaves black with really bad minor pieces, quite frankly. But queen f5 is still a pretty good move. You kick the bishop with a tempo, which is cool. White goes knight c3, trying to mix it up a bit. If knight c3, to go bc3 and counterattack the knight, which is maybe not so clear, despite the ugly-looking structure. But black correctly plays knight b4. Well done to black for finding the move. White has to go rook g3 to defend the rook and defend the bishop. Computer wants to go f6 and just say, yeah, your pin just doesn't do anything, and I'm just going to kick you out and just have a completely dominant, nightmare for white. But the game went rook a6, which, okay, also a very good move and quite creative to lift the rook in the attack like that. White goes bishop e3, trying to anticipate it. Apparently knight b5 is the best try, but white's already in a bad way. We have bishop e3, black goes... Interesting enough, he doesn't play the move rook to g6, and I'm not quite sure why. Maybe he was not wanting to deal with bishop d4, but actually bishop d4 is not a threat whatsoever. Actually, I'm playing e4 too fast, because... Okay, rook d8 was a move I was considering, but actually e4 is the right move. Go when that Grandmaster Intuition kicks in. But okay, if they go knight e2, well, if they go queen d4, knight c2 is the first point to mention, but if they go knight b5, you just go d3, and white's actually not really threatening to take c7. Because if they do take, I mean, in the worst case, you got queen c6, and yeah, it looks pretty good just here. Take the pawn back, and, you know, your pawn is an absolute monster, anchored in by the defending knight on the outpost, and white is kind of strategically lost for this reason. But black goes rook d8, and okay, you're still much better. White goes rook g5, knight e, queen e6. Knight b5 is a nice move. Like, now with a pin, white's actually getting a bit back into the game. Again, a principle that the queen is not so badly placed against the rook if that rook is undefended. Black plays rook c6, and yeah, now white is sort of getting back into it, actually. Like, now white has got an extra pawn. Granted, his tree is in a big pin at the moment, and, well, black finds a very nice move of queen h6 to try to use the pin. But it's still quite complex, and here white unfortunately makes a very big blunder that costs him the game. What white should do is he should play the move queen rook to g4. Because you go queen g4, I believe you have like just rook d4, and, you know, you win a piece with tactics there. And then after rook g6, the idea is, yeah, black is trying to win the piece this way, but white is in time actually to play queen at e2. Or queen f3 also works. Take, take. The bishop is defended. You know, you're ready to meet knight c2 of rook d1 to keep the extra pawn. And probably what he was worried about was f5, and he thought, okay, I'm going to lose the piece. But actually, white can play the intermezzo of bishop g7, and it turns out that white actually has enough compensation for the piece because the black king has absolutely no pawn cover. You might notice a similarity perhaps between this position and the Esipenko-Giri game that we saw earlier, just with colors reversed. And if black goes queen b2, I mean, you know, white's just going to start giving checks against the king, and it's probably at least a draw, maybe even better with rook e1. So, yeah, so white's just doing fine here. And a draw would probably be the right outcome. Instead, white goes h4, and yeah, h4 just ends up being a blunder here. As after the move rook g6, which maybe is what white underestimated. Well, now the difference is you don't have queen g4 anymore, because simply knight c2, and it just all falls apart. Like, if you go rook to d1, black can just trade the rooks, and then play, like, queen to e6, saying that, okay, at some point, my queen is going to attack your bishop, and win it that way. Or if they do trade the queens, then, yeah, you can't move the bishop out of the way, because then the rook is hanging. And again, black wins a piece. So ultimately, the game ended with rook to a3, trying to rook lift that way, but after take, queen h4, either black wins a piece, or white goes g4 and leaves his king completely naked. Queen takes g5, and still there's a question like, how do you save the bishop, right? So rook h3, black goes queen to f4, using the pin, and, you know, white is hoping for a miracle, but it doesn't come. Queen b1, queen takes g4. King to h2, rook takes d4, and we see quite clearly that white has a couple of checks, but obviously no remaining attack, and therefore Ganguly resigned at this point. I kind of feel a little bit bad actually showing us Ganguly's losses in these recaps, but yeah, it's, you know, way it goes. When you're a strong player, sometimes you see your losses as well as your wins. Anyway, there were also, I think, a couple of other games that were kind of interesting. I don't know if we have time to really go for them. I mean, Warmadam against Lamy between the two 600 plus Dutch players in the field. But it's kind of an interesting opening. There was a sort of Catalan where, you know, I saw it at this point, white had this interesting positional compensation. But then Lamy kind of just gave back the pawn and maintained the balance, and was a little bit of a boring draw after that. Also, Mirrors against Marc-Andre Maritzi. It was kind of an interesting opening where white switched to some weird Catalan position, but he never really managed to justify it, and, well, the game just ended up being another solid draw. There were a couple of other interesting games, though, and, well, I don't think we have time to cover the game between Rove and Vogel against Zhu Jina, which was a game won by the Chinese female player, as it were, in a game between the two bottom seeds. But this game between Belgium's Daniel Dardha against the Russian player Polina Shuvalova, well, I think this is a very interesting game. And it's a pretty short one as well, where Shuvalova decided to play a slightly unusual opening for this game, and went for the Tarrasch system with c5. It's kind of funny. Maybe she was inspired by Carlsen playing the Tarrasch against Shankland, or maybe not, because she played e takes d5 rather than Carlsen's cd4 von Hennig Shira. And after that f3, like, the reason that the Tarrasch is not that popular, as I explained in my blog post on chess.com, how to not, I don't know what to play against 1d4. I explained that knight c6, runs into dc5, and white just gets this very pleasant advantage with the bishop pair even after they get back the pawn. But probably playing knight f6 is that bishop g5 comes, and okay, probably these guys did see the chess.com blog post I wrote, because, well, A, a lot of people saw it, and B, she played bishop e6, and she knew to play this line with e3 and c4, and, try to get a Gagosian style play. Unfortunately, Shuvalova's next moves were probably not the best, because she ended up in a lost position rather quickly out of the next 10 or so moves. Like, the normal approach is just go bishop e2, bishop b4, and, just kind of go for knight e5 and try to get some initiative this way. And, you can try to potentially double the pawns and say they're a little bit exposed. But it's only a small advantage for white, so it's still quite playable from black's perspective. Like, in a position like this, I mean, the king might look kind of open after the pawns are doubled. But it's actually not that easy for white to target these pawns in reality. And it's kind of the reason why actually one student I said, yeah, if you want to play the Tarish, you can play it. It's like, it's not such a bad opening that I would forbid you from playing it in a sense. It's only a little bit bad. But the game saw knight e5, and white, well, is trying to be a little bit tricky with the move order. Maybe, you can try to go g3, bishop g2, could be some creative idea. Well, Shuvalov's queen a5 is a good move, trying to put some pressure here. Knight e4 is clearly a big threat, yes, so white has to go bishop f6. And it's sort of the reason why knight e5 is objectively not the most precise, because you're having to give back two tempi moving a knight back and forth to double the pawns, and, the double pawn's not even on open file. But maybe Dardha's logic was he realized that his opponent would be a bit uncomfortable in this sort of position, because that definitely seems to be the case of, maybe why black's moves were not the very best. Well, she played knight c6. I mean, I guess if you could play, like, bishop b4, queen c1, flick these moves in, but it doesn't overly change the position. But it does surprise me a little bit that Shuvalova didn't go bishop b4 and, gain a tempo on the knight at least. I mean, I guess you could also potentially go knight d7. It would be another way to develop the pieces, and, well, definitely it's an approach that the theoreticians can explore, or rather the fellow theoreticians can explore. Because, yeah, my computer is saying that this sort of position is, like, a little better for white, because of the very inflexible structure, but also you have some space, and it's not that easy for white to go for a great pawn break. I mean, yeah, later maybe you go for like b4, but then it's kind of like, so what? Black can bring knight to e4, castle long, and black's got ideas as well, right? But after knight c6, well, now I feel like position does start to get kind of very good for white. Black goes bishop to f5. Yeah, bishop a3 looks kind of clever, but just queen c1 kind of puts a stop to all the tricks in the end. But still, maybe going for this kind of ending, like, might have been a better play. Okay, queen c3 is kind of a beautiful trick, so it's sort of a pity that it doesn't lead to more for black. But maybe this is a way to kind of beg for a draw successfully. Because after bishop f5, I think that white is just much better after a3. Okay, apparently knight h4 is a move as well, but it ends up coming next turn after long castle knight h4, and I mean, black just doesn't have a good pawn break, and in these kind of closed positions, if you don't have a good pawn break, you just don't really have a good plan. The game ended surprisingly quickly, though, in spite of this. I mean, maybe you just have to go king b8, h5, and hope that you have some fortress here. But the game saw bishop e7 instead. Black relies on some more natural developing moves, but yeah, still a very sad position. Apparently, queen h5 is even better, just to, lure, like, bishop h4, and just say black doesn't even have the bishop pair to compensate for the weak pawns. But in that case, white would not have won the game with a forced checkmate on move 22. So white goes knight f3. We have king b8, and okay, b4 is not the first line of the engine, which wants to go like knight e2, but okay, I think this is still a pretty strong move, to be fair. Because if black takes on passant, you just have a very easy attack down that b file against the king, and black, h5, h4 just does nothing. Actually, if h5, you could even play a move like h4 and just completely kill the attack before it even begins. Good or good. But after queen c7, well, now the pawns are just going to start rolling, just creating some problems. Actually, in the game, white decides to go queen a4, because I guess he saw a very nice little trick. That, as it so happens, rather than playing like queen b6 or king b8 and hoping for some miracle as black decided she didn't want to face a very long torture, and so we had the move knight b8, which unfortunately is a blunder, and, well, it's a good moment to see if you can find the winning move to just end the game on the spot. Dardha did manage to find it, playing the move knight b5. And black sportingly decided to allow the mate on the board with queen b6. And now, not a Botez gambit, but a smothered mate. queen takes a7, queen takes a7, and knight c7 checkmate. This is how the game ended. So a very beautiful game, I think, to conclude this video. We're at about the 1 hour mark, so congratulations to all of you who managed to get through the whole recap. It shows you're serious about improving your chess. And since you're serious about improving your chess and getting that master level, then I'm also serious about helping you out on a more personal level. Just make sure to use the link below in the description to DM me about how we can get you from a 2000 plus level to a 2200 plus or even a 2300 plus level. I look forward to having some chats with you about that. In the meantime, I'll see you guys in the next video. Take care. And remember also, tomorrow is a rest day, so you'll get to enjoy the rest.